Hello and welcome to episode 21 of AS for Architecture with me, Ambrose Gillick. I'm talking today with Jim Stockard of Harvard University's Graduate School of Design about his Loeb Fellowship Programme lecture, Affordable Housing, It's Just a Right, and a piece Jim wrote for the TEDx blog entitled Why Affordable Housing Needs to be a Right, Not a Privilege.
I know people would like to say this business about, some towns just don't need affordable housing, right? Wellesley is a town full of rich people here in Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. Well, guess what? Every police officer, every fire person, every waiter in a restaurant, every clerk in a store in that town, every school teacher is eligible for the affordable housing. They all make incomes less than 80% of very median income. Mm-hmm. And of course, in a place like Cambridge, we get a brand new school teacher in our school system. They're energetic and have all the latest techniques and they're excited, but they don't have any background, right? So they take the first job they can find. Well, they get a job in Cambridge and they can't afford to live within 30 miles of Cambridge. So they live up in Revere and way up north. And they drive down to Cambridge every day. It's this terrible commute. And as soon as they get 3 years or 4 years under their belt as a school teacher and have a resume, they apply for a job closer to Revere. And they leave the Cambridge school system and go to Revere, where they're now an experienced teacher. And we have to fill another job. Now, a lot of people say, oh, it's a school system problem, or it's a human resources problem, or it's a housing problem.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome again to A is for Architecture. I'm talking today to Jim Stockard. Jim, would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, I have the pleasure of meeting Ambrose when he was a scholar and a teacher at Glasgow School of Art. I'm a housing guy. I have a fairly long career doing a range of activities in the arena of affordable housing. I've been very, very lucky in my career to have a chance to work for local public agencies, state bodies, national, U.S. Congress, and in places around the country, at the nonprofit and public sector and for-profit arena. I've helped people build housing. I've helped people study housing. I've helped people develop housing policies that would work for their communities. And for the last bunch of years, I've been able to teach about housing, which has been a great pleasure. I've taught at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, graduate students for the most part, about housing issues. So as I said, Ambrose, I'm a housing guy, and that's the beginning and end of the story.
But you're not an architect, you're a planner, is that right?
That's correct. I have an undergraduate degree in architecture, and I realized, frankly, that I didn't have a gift for that. I think architects who are good at that have a gift, and I didn't have it. Even though I wanted to have it, I didn't have it. And so I switched to urban planning, which for me was the right choice. I'm a planner, and I like being a planner. I like the diversity of roles I get to do as a city planner.
So that was training in the 80s?
Oh, I'm afraid it was before that. My master's
I'm so good at this.
My master's degree in city planning was issued in 1968.
Oh, right. So you were learning during that whole, I suppose the turn perhaps against that post-war dominant New York style highways and.
Exactly right. And the great good fortune I had was to stumble into work with a planner who became my mentor and who was a great advocate of the changes that we were making in those days in the planning field. He was a practitioner and an advocate for what we then called citizen participation. Mm-hmm. Paul Davidoff had written an important work about engagement of the citizenry as a counter to the top-down urban renewal planning that was so had dominated this country in the 40s and 50s and still to some extent in the 60s. And so I was nurtured in the beginning of my career in bottom-up planning, in the business of listening to the citizens about what's important for their communities, their housing, and so on. So yes, that's right. I came into this field at a sort of an interesting turning point in how we thought about cities in those days.
And were you in the Boston at that time?
Yes, I my graduate degree was from Harvard here, and this first job I got in the summer was a job at City Hall in Cambridge. And so I worked at City Hall in Cambridge, doing housing work, learning about the housing field. And shortly after about a year in that office, Justin, my mentor, set up a consulting firm and asked me to join him in that firm, where we tried to do this kind of work in other places around Massachusetts and eventually broader than that. And so for 27 years, I worked for Justin and or the successor to his firm. We changed the names and changed the participants a number of times, but my longtime partner, Bob Engler, and I were the sort of commonality of that firm for the 27 years. And it still exists today. Bob is still doing that work today after I left the firm to go to run the Loeb Fellowship.
So Citizen, this is off piece because I sent you some provocations beforehand, which were to do with housing. But I think this is, I think if I'm starting to sort of let the jigsaw pieces fall into place here, why this issue around affordability, and I guess it's a justice orientated perspective you have towards housing, which is, it's also pragmatic. You make this point in the couple of things that the talk you gave at the time you finished in the Loeb Fellowship at GSD, and then also a nice thing on the TED Talks blog. What does citizen involvement in planning? Because I've looked into citizen participation and how, Sherry Arnstein's Ladder of Citizen Participation, and I've read a huge amount around that. And in the contemporary period, citizen participation seems to me to have been somewhat denatured, commodified, commercialized, and corrupted, maybe? Is that fair?
Yes, it is. Well, I would say a couple of things, Ambrose. First, the story I really like to tell my students. A friend of mine years and years and years ago wrote a book called The Active Patient's Guide to Good Medical Care. And in the book, he says, every meeting between a patient and myself is a meeting of two experts. I'm an expert in chemistry and biology and disease and illness. The patient is an expert in what they feel in the way of pain, what they're willing to tolerate, what their goals are in terms of their health. And if we don't each listen to each other and give credibility to each other's knowledge, we won't have a very successful meeting. And that's the way I think of citizen engagement in the planning field. There are some things I know about cities that the average citizen walking around the street probably doesn't know. I know, for example, here in my neighborhood, it's very difficult to have both decreased density and lots more mom and pop stores. Mom and pop stores need foot traffic, and therefore they need density. And it's very hard to make a mom and pop store work in a very low density neighborhood. Starbucks can throw a store in there and use it as a loss leader and not really care very much whether it makes money or not, but they're trying to get people to buy Starbucks in other places. And so that's something that I know that average walking around citizens don't know. On the other hand, I don't know about living in the neighborhood I'm working with. I've never lived there. I don't know what's inconvenient or convenient. I don't know what's safe or unsafe. I don't know who the people are that keep the neighborhood knit together. The bartenders, the president, the superintendent of the schools, the headmaster at the local elementary school, the minister, whoever. And so I got to listen to the citizens about what they're expert at, and they need to listen to me a little bit at what I'm expert at. So I think that citizen engagement, participation's not as good a word, I don't think anymore, but engagement does demand something of me and of the citizens.
Yeah,
I need to share my knowledge and explain where my knowledge comes from, and I need to listen really hard. And the residents need to understand and take seriously what I offer them, but also to share their knowledge with me and tell me what works and doesn't work. so that we have an engaged conversation. We each bring our own skill set to the table. And a good example is the question of affordable housing and property values. Many people assume that if you build some affordable housing in their neighborhood, their property value will go down. And since in this country, at least, about 75% of everybody's personal net worth is the equity they have in the home they own, then they're nervous about the property value going down. It's stealing their wealth. And so they assume that affordable housing down the street will steal some of their wealth. In point of fact, all the research we have about affordable housing these days in the 21st century and the latter part of the 20th century is that either your property value will stay the same or it will actually go up. And the reason is that when people imagine affordable housing going up down the road, what they imagine is an old style, high rise, ill maintained, no grass, kind of seedy place, and assume that will impact their property values negatively. In point of fact, in this day and age, nobody builds housing like that anymore. Yeah. And affordable housing producers know that it's important to them and for their neighborhoods and to their own work that they make really handsome places that are well kept, well maintained, the residents, the leases enforced, and the places in addition to the neighborhood, not a subtraction. So residents have to be willing to deal with that and learn from that and work on that, and then tell us more about where is a good location for some new housing. What do we need in the way of transportation in this neighborhood to make new housing work? What's the situation with the schools and the parks and the playgrounds? Those are things that we can learn from neighbors that none of us will ever know since we don't live there. So I think you're absolutely right, Ambrose, that there has been a sort of a dumbing down of this whole enterprise. Well, let's have 2 public meetings. As long as we have 20 people in the meeting, check off the box and we're done. Or I'm going in to stop this project. I don't care what they say to me tonight. I'm stopping this project, whatever it is. I don't want any changes in my neighborhood. So if we could get to the table in a civil way, there are people now, some of the technology is working now to help us have better communication with people. There are many people who have devised techniques, a lot of model making, a lot of drawing on maps and helping people think about their neighborhoods and make comments about what's great about their neighborhood. People get kids involved in this kind of conversation. So it's a must do. We can't go back to top-down planning, Ambrose, for sure. But we can also get better at the way in which my own pet peeve is planners who only show up in a neighborhood when there's a project to be talked about. Because the natural history of that is they've been working on that project for 6 months. They've been working back and forth with the one who's going to build it or develop it or shape it or whatever. They have become invested. And so when they get to the meeting with the citizens, they get defensive whenever anybody's got a question about this new element in the neighborhood. And so that's a really bad form of citizen engagement. And I frankly think we'd be better off if planners basically were hanging around the neighborhoods that they're responsible for all the time without a project to advocate for or to discuss. Just ask questions. So what's going on now? I hear the pastor at the church down the street just got changed. What's the new guy like? And I saw Ruby's close. That was a great restaurant, wasn't it? What's going to go in Ruby's spot? And those kinds of conversations that are not so loaded and not so ready to explode in a meeting. So I'd like us planners to be more engaged, more regularly, without something to advocate for.
I mean, I think that's a really interesting point that you started with, this idea of the professional not having this false humility about their expertise. I think a lot of the participation engagement that I have encountered and perhaps even been involved in is really based around a kind of performance of humility, when you go in as the professional and pretend that that the citizen has more power to define the brief than they really do, because what you're essentially asking them to do is architectural design or urban design work, which they can't do. And so in a way, it's actually a rather noxious power play, because you throw on people something that they feel out of their depth with. And so they step back and hide, and then you can carry on doing what you like. And I actually think that that's not accidental. I think that's strategic. I think that is, with bad urban planning, of which there is still quite a bit. And I think you might have seen.
Oh, in your country too? Oh, I'm shocked.
But I did wonder. You've, as you said, in your practice, you've worked with non-profit, public sector, and for-profit sector. Who have got this community engagement down? Who are doing it best? Oh, I mean, it's probably not a straight diagram, but
yeah.
What makes, who's got the resources, I suppose, isn't it?
Well, I think it's a combination of the resources to spend the time it takes to do it, and the attitudes of the organization. I will tell you, in this country, we have 3,500 housing authorities. They're like your housing councils. These are public bodies that they're not the city council, but they're an independent public body that owns the affordable housing that we call public housing. It's like your social housing. Many of those bodies are absolutely terrible at this kind of work. A few are really quite brilliant at it. And I think that begins with the directors of those organizations and works its way down through the staff. It means that when they recruit people for their staff, they recruit people that share that point of view. One important quality, and this may get to your point, Rosa, one important quality is patience. On that score, you can probably almost draw a line from the least patient being the for-profit guys, the medium patient being the nonprofits, and the patient being the housing authorities, councils in your language. The for-profits, time is money. We got to make this decision fast. We'll get one meeting and get this out of the way. The nonprofits, many of the ones that I've worked with, are really neighborhood based. Some of the staff lives in the neighborhood. Sometimes the director does. The board members are all from the neighborhood. And they kind of had a motivation to get it right as opposed to hurry up. And so they're a little better at the question of engagement, I think. They can, in some cases, be almost too good. Well, Harry missed the last meeting, so even though we made a bunch of decisions, we got to do the meeting again so Harry can be in the meeting. Well, maybe not. And the housing authorities, whose funding and is the most secure of all of these groups, are perhaps the ones that, if they choose, can be as patient as possible, and they can have as many meetings as they want to, or surveys, or tours, or whatever else might be appropriate for some engagement processes. But there are exceptions to that rule on all sides. There's some for-profit folks who are terrific at this. One of our for-profit developers here in Boston converted two major public housing sites that were very troubled into mixed income properties, and had them owned by a nonprofit corporation with two board members. Two board members were from his company, which is a for-profit development company, and two board members were residents from the developments. And the rest of his developer friends said, "What are you, crazy, man? You're gonna let the tenants have half the votes on the board of directors of this thing? They could screw everything else up." And Joe, very wise man, said, "No, you guys don't understand. They want exactly the same thing out of this property that I want. They want the apartments to be filled. They want the lease to be enforced. They want the grounds to look nice. They want you to collect the rent in a fair way. They want all the same things we want. It's just working our way to getting there." And so these boards are, and because they have half a role in this thing, they learn more about it. they get to know what it's like to make the budget balanced and what it's like when one of the maintenance guys is not doing his job. And so they share with us the issues around keeping a development healthy, and help us do a better job, because they have knowledge about certain kind of things that we'll never get back at the office. So that's a for-profit guy who's better at this stuff than lots of nonprofits or public agencies.
But the thing that points to, so one of the in the provocations I sent you, so I'm getting there, but one of the things that I thought about as I was taking the train home from university just now was this issue around sense of ownership, and that's what you're talking about here.
Yes.
Of somehow helping citizens, helping residents feel like they are invested and important within the process at all stages, from because when you were talking about, the ideal situation would be to have your planners in the neighborhood finding out, in real time what's happening so that they could make informed decisions. That again is about trying to get a sense of meaning and ownership into these. Exactly right.
Exactly right. It's critically important, Amber. I'm glad you put those words on it, because that's exactly right. And you can own a lot of things. You can own your apartment or your house. You can own the development that you're a part of. You can own the community, the neighborhood that you're a part of. You can own the process and feel like, yes, you make a difference. And boy, does that make a difference in the way things, in the outcomes, for sure, if people feel that sense of ownership. Don't get me wrong. There are some potholes in that road, right? There's some people who I've known some spectacular citizen participants, some just glorious people. My friend Sandra Graham, who was such a good citizen activist, she literally walked up on the stage of Harvard graduation, grabbed the microphone out of the president's hand, and told the entire audience how they were doing bad things to her neighborhood. Now that's a citizen person that we should all be thankful for. Sandra was one of my heroes.
When was this? When did this happen?
Oh, this is literally back probably in the middle 70s sometimes.
I bet we can find a video of that. I'm sure that was filmed.
There must have been a video somewhere. You're right. So people like Sandra, I would always listen to whatever she was saying, and she did help us in our reform of the Cambridge Housing Authority with some very critical engagement with some citizens. But I've also known some citizen advocates like that who took advantage of their ownership positions. They were on the boards of a program, and the major outcome of that program was the board member got a nice home with a big assistance for it. And so I don't want to be naive here and whitewash the whole thing. But again, one of the reasons that those not so good engaged persons can do that is because fewer people are engaged. I was sensed that in the one particular case I'm thinking about, that if there had been a more robust effort to make more and more citizens engaged in the process, they would have shut this other person down. They would have told her she couldn't benefit from that. She couldn't get that home at a big discount because it was favoritism and conflict of interest for her sitting on the board. So that pressure wasn't there from other citizens around her, and so she got away with it. So it's about getting as many people to have that ownership you spoke about as you possibly can.
So this ownership idea, comes towards something to do with citizenship, doesn't it? Of creating through housing and through, I guess in your case, planning practice and planning and the development of planning policy, creating good citizens. Which comes to a point around the importance of housing, because you are very, very evangelical about the right to affordable housing.
Yes.
I just wanted you to talk about a bit about that. Like, obviously, beyond the sort of Maslowian primary needs of Abraham Maslow's triangle, everybody needs a house. We get that. But why is it so important?
Well, I think there's a wonderful book written here recently by a guy named Matt Desmond called Evicted. I would passionately recommend it to your students. And he's a sociologist who went and lived in Milwaukee and spent time with 5 different families, each of whom suffered an eviction or several evictions in the course of his time there. And what that book did for me was make even more real than I thought I understood before how critical housing security is to a reasonable life. If you're worried about where you're going to sleep next week, or how you're possibly going to be able to pay the rent next month, or how to get everybody into the car so you can move to another place for the 4th time in a year, you just can't attend to the rest of your life. You can't look for a job, you can't go to school, you can't arrange for good food for your family, you can't get the health care you need. The average homeless or near homeless child in America moves 3 times within a school year. That's 4 different classmates, 4 different teachers, 4 different curriculums. The likelihood of that child thriving in the future is very slim. Some do, but they're working with 2.5 strikes against them. And so I believe that for the health of our society, it's really important that everybody know where they're going to sleep tonight, know how they're going to pay for their house for the next future, and that stability will unlock their potential, whatever that might be, to contribute to the broader culture. And so it's you're right. It's a bit of a moral issue for me. If we lived in a very poor society where we're all kind of trying to scrape together a few branches of a tree to shelter us from the rain, that might be a little different. But we're not. We're a very rich society, Ambrose, in the States. And there is no reason in the world why any person shouldn't be able to have a decent place to sleep tonight that will get them out of the rain and be affordable and have enough space for their family.
It is a really interesting one. I mean, when you were in Glasgow, around that same time, I was doing research on housing, but the architectural history, which was,
right.
Basically moral free. Anyway.
Now.
Work without ethical content. No, and it was.
I'm sure I've met a couple of architects who have strong morals. I'm sure I have.
Yeah, historians, I'm not sure. Anyway, and I met this woman. I was out by the canal in Glasgow, and I met this woman. I got talking to her because she had nice dogs that I was stroking, and she had just been moved from her house in the east end of Glasgow to a house in the west end of Glasgow. And I had known that tenure, like legal tenure, was a critical issue because I'd seen it in other work I'd done in other countries and stuff. But it just suddenly, the penny dropped. This idea that this basic understanding of the world that middle class people have, which is
right.
that you can live where you want to live, right, is not available to a very large number of people.
Exactly.
That their accommodation, their right to live in a place, is by the grace of somebody else.
Right.
It's a remarkable. It was just a remarkable thing, and I just suddenly struck me. Yeah, that issue around, as you say, it is a moral issue. So what does housing? How would you define affordable housing then? Because in London at the moment, I think affordable housing is something like 2/3 market value, and obviously the market value is glitteringly expensive. So affordable housing isn't affordable.
Well, we have a definition for it in this country, which is it's got some problems, but it's not a bad place to start. Affordable housing with a capital A and a capital H are that set of programs we have that primarily are aimed at people whose income is 80% of the median in their area or less. So roughly speaking, the lower 40% of the population in terms of income. And then the other requirement is that the rent that they pay should not be more than 30% of their income. So if your income is $1,000 a month, your rent should not be more than $300. That requires subsidies. It is not possible in our country to build a home paying sort of reasonable cost for land and labor and materials and taxes and so on and so forth, and make it available to people in that income category without some form of subsidy. And so we have a bunch of programs to do that with. The oldest one is this public housing program I was talking about, like your council housing. And in that case, the federal government gave the housing authorities 100% grant to build their homes. So there's no mortgage. And then they realized 30 years after they started that even the tenant's capacity to pay rent wasn't enough to cover the operating expenses, pay for cutting the lawn and painting the halls and fixing the plumbing. So they provided an operating subsidy to make sure that every tenant's, so the housing authority basically would look at their operating budget, and then they would look at their tenants and look at their incomes and take 30% of that number. And the federal government, in theory, made up the gap between what tenants could afford to pay and what it would cost to run the place. They botched the theory, they botched the system a lot in those days. But since then, we've developed other programs that have helped nonprofits get into the housing world, like your associations. And even some of our for-profit operators will do affordable housing developments by taking advantage of one or the other of the subsidies that are available. Our low-income housing tax credit is a big program for producing equity for developers to reduce the development cost. Housing authorities can award housing vouchers to developers they can use to serve residents of low income. So but if you take that definition, Ambrose, that is people who are under 80% of median and who have rents that are and have rents created that are under 30% of their income, then we have money for about a quarter of those people. So we have a grand total of somewhere around 5 million homes that are available through the public housing program or the low income housing tax credit program or one of the others. And we have a need of about 20 million. So we're 15 million short at the households. That's households, not individuals, households. So it's more individuals. And so that's our definition of affordable housing. There are, of course, what we call in this country NOAHs, naturally occurring affordable housing. That is, Aunt Tilly has been renting to Fred for years, and Aunt Tilly has just never raised the rent, and so it's still pretty affordable for Fred. Michael Stone has written some interesting work, professor at UMass Boston, about shelter rent, arguing that 30% is a bad number. If Bill Gates pays 30% of his income for his rent, he's got a lot of money left over to do other stuff with. Mm-hmm. But if a person earning $15,000 a year pays 30% of that money for rent, they've got nothing left over to buy food and get healthcare and books for their kids and so on. So Michael has argued that that should be a sliding scale below the 80% of median number. I'm sure your students have learned by now about this distinction between housing cost, which is about land and mortar and brick and lumber and taxes and so on, and housing price, which is what we rent the place for, sell the place for, because housing price and housing cost have almost nothing to do with each other. Housing price is entirely a product of supply and demand. So the average rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in Cambridge right now is $3,500 per month. It's just outrageous, and it's affordable only by literally rich people. And the reason is because so many people want to live in Cambridge, right? It's got these 2 big universities which have huge staffs. It's 1-2 subway stops away from Boston. It's kind of cool in Harvard Square. So the demand to live in Cambridge is ferocious, and the ability to increase supply is almost non-existent. There really essentially is no vacant land in Cambridge. It's just a question of, can I buy somebody's house, tear it down, and build 5 units where there was only 1 before? So that supply and demand problem exists all over the country, right?
Yeah.
In Des Moines, it's not so bad, but in San Francisco, it's horrible, and New York and Los Angeles and so on and so forth. Basically, everywhere that people want to live.
Yeah, I remember when I was out in California one time, and I read a story about one of the rookies for one of the NFL teams, or one of the basketball teams. Anyway, should have been really well paid, but still couldn't afford to live in San Francisco.
That's right. Well, and the problem is, Ambrose, that I know people would like to say this business about, some towns just don't need affordable housing, right? Wellesley is a town full of rich people here in Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. Well, guess what? Every police officer, every fire person, every waiter in a restaurant, every clerk in a store in that town, every school teacher is eligible for the affordable housing. They all make incomes less than 80% of very median income. Mm-hmm. And of course, you've heard me talk, maybe in a place like Cambridge, we get a brand new school teacher in our school system. They're energetic and have all the latest techniques, and they're excited, but they don't have any background, right? So they take the first job they can find. Well, they get a job in Cambridge, and they can't afford to live within 30 miles of Cambridge. So they live up in Revere and way up north. And they drive down to Cambridge every day. It's this terrible commute. And as soon as they get 3 years or 4 years under their belt as a school teacher and have a resume, they apply for a job closer to Revere. And they leave the Cambridge school system and go to Revere, where they're now an experienced teacher. And we have to fill another job. Now, a lot of people say, oh, it's a school system problem, or it's a human resources problem, or it's a housing problem. Mm-hmm. And our city has to keep retraining and keep recruiting new people to come and teach in our school system. There's some good things about that. But by and large, if we had a better, more diverse, more scattered housing sector, we would have more teachers who could stay into their years of becoming veteran teachers and with all that experience. So it's another way in which housing is really important for communities to understand their needs for this. And you can even go further and talk about the environmental issues. That woman driving down from Revere every day, that's terrible for the air quality and the fuels used and so on and so forth. If she could walk to work from someplace in Cambridge, that would be much better for us environmentally.
So how do you resolve this? So if demand dictates the price of housing. I was talking to a chap called Professor Greg Keefe, who's leads the architecture school, or led the architecture school at Queen's in Belfast, and he was talking about the example of Japan, where he said housing depreciates in value in Japan, like any other commodity. Now, that sounds pretty good to me, because obviously, I mean, it doesn't sound good to me because I've just bought my first house. So I'm hoping to...
You've crossed the river, Mr. Gillick.
I certainly
now
have.
You're a little suspect here.
I know. And it wasn't what we had, it wasn't the dream. The dream was something different and something cooperative and shared and mutual, because it would be nice to have someone to help me look after my children. No.
There you go.
To be quite honest, no. So what are how is this addressed? How can this be addressed?
Well,
because densification is the proposed solution, isn't it? You make more units, and they're smaller units, and to maintain, because there comes these intersections about how heights of buildings and qualities of the area, conservation areas and so on. You can't go too high, so you end up making smaller and smaller units, and that doesn't seem to be a very sensible solution.
Well, I think there are a couple of paths. One certainly is a little bit more densification. there are places in our, I mean, I'm unfortunately one of those people who could happily live in Manhattan. So density doesn't scare me at all. I'm not sure my wife feels the same way, but density is okay with me. But I realize it's not so good for everybody, and therefore we need a wider range of solutions. So the first one to think about is on that score, I think is the medium height, high density kinds of things. In other words, you walk around Paris, right? Paris doesn't have a whole lot of, at least last time I was there, it doesn't have a whole lot of 30-story buildings, but they have an awful lot of buildings that are 5 stories tall, all over the city, and those buildings are full of people, and that means that the stores are healthy in those neighborhoods, and the transportation systems have enough riders to make sense for them, and so that sort of not so much stretching for lawns in the city as to say we can fill up the blocks with buildings that don't have to be 20 stories high, but if they're 5 stories high or 6 stories high, they can hold a lot of people, and that can make the city work better economically and environmentally and in other kinds of ways. Another solution, intriguingly enough, is home ownership. Cambridge, for example, has a first-time homebuyer program where the city will give you a big chunk of change if you're in that under 80%. That's the home ownership program goes up to 120% of median income. We'll give you a big chunk of change, a couple $100,000 to help write down the cost of your home. And then when you get ready to move out of that home, we will require that you sell it to another eligible homeowner for a price that's the same level of discount that you got when you bought it. And so what we've done now is create a 500 home stock, mostly condominiums, to be fair, not single family homes, but we now have 500 homes that are sort of a rolling group of places where people can learn to be a good homeowner. They can learn about the importance of maintenance and relying on themselves to figure out who's going to come fix their faucet when it breaks, and putting aside money for their capital improvements down the road and paying their mortgage on time. And if they're lucky and their income goes up, they can move out of that place and get into a home where they can benefit from the real estate appreciation. But we've got 500 homes now that are essentially early home ownership opportunities. And that's another way to do this kind of thing that does move people toward the ownership status that they might want. I think there's lots to be said for mixed income housing, that is some market rate homes and some that are more subsidized. In Cambridge, we have a good inclusionary zoning ordinance where if you build more than 10 homes in the city, then 20% of them must be made affordable for people in this 80% and under category. And so that means every time somebody builds 10 homes, we've got 2 of them are affordable. And so we've got the whole city stock, we are about at 18% affordable. But if every new development gets 20% affordable, we'll creep up toward that 20% number over time. I think we ought to be speaking to the people responsible for creating our housing crisis in Cambridge. These universities have huge attractions for staff, for faculty, and for students. While Harvard houses most of their undergraduates, they only house about a fourth of their graduate students. And that means they're out there in the market competing with Joe and Jane and their 2 kids for a 2-bedroom apartment. So when we lost rent control a number of years ago, when the state outlawed rent control, we lost 2,000 kids from our school system. We closed 5 schools because those families couldn't compete any longer. So we need to ask the universities to play a bigger role in housing their own students, that is the ones who really have to be on the campus, and for making a contribution to the housing of their other people, their staff and their faculty, who are naturally drawn to the universities. So
that's quite an interesting idea. That's quite almost like that's almost an idea out of the Victorian period, isn't it?
It is.
Like this idea of the factory owner providing workers' cottages. or terraced housing or whatever it is. It's quite an interesting idea. It's a radical idea.
Well, there historically over time there have been problems with company towns, as you well know, and so I don't quite know what the arrangement is here for whether you say to the university you've got to build housing for your staff and faculty, whether you say, you've got to facilitate enough homes in this community that 40% of your staff and faculty could live there if they chose. And if it's not them, it's somebody else in those income categories. I'm not sure quite what the mechanism is, but I definitely think that they need to play a bigger role in because they are the creators of our housing problem. And so they need to take some responsibility. Universities, I hope I'm not offending anybody. I say this, universities are these large universities that people like you and I work for, Ambrose, are pretty good at seeing their role in the world and creating new knowledge and training people to take care of problems around the world. And they're also pretty good at national stuff. We train some future senators and mayors and scientists and teachers and so all that stuff. They are crappy neighbors to the cities they live in. They're just awful. And it's as if they build a wall around their campus and say, nothing exists out there outside our wall. And so I think they need to do more about this, and I think they need to be called into accountability.
Yeah, and I think your university has probably got a bit of spare change down the back of the sofa that it could perhaps.
It's true that if they dig deep in their pockets, they can find some cash.
Stick some half-sucked sweets, maybe a conker or two, and some copper. Exactly. That's right.
Exactly.
So, that touches on this theme of gentrification, and we have exactly the same problem in Britain with our universities essentially turning our most desirable parts of our cities, which in Britain is generally speaking the West End of cities, into de facto ghettos for students, and obviously the other thing about students is that they don't actually spend very much money, so they're not even useful. They don't eat much. They drink a lot, but they tend to drink in student bars, and then they don't do shopping. Go to clothes shops. They might eat in cafes. So they disfigure the kind of character of the city, which is the reason that the university is there in the first place. It's
right.
So it's a bit of a mess. But we could talk about gentrification forever, I suppose, and it's a big issue. I did want to go on to talk about this idea of barriers to housing. So you mentioned in your TED Talk blog, you mentioned money and regulation, and I think we've touched on that. But this idea of regulation. So I spent a lot of time thinking about and reading Elinor Ostrom, the economist Elinor Ostrom, who Nobel laureate from 2007, and she talked about one of the papers that she wrote talked about co-production, and she talked about how there are barriers, essentially barriers to the kind of the co-production of services, and housing in the way that we're talking about it is a service, isn't it? It's not in every country in the world. Housing is not necessarily a service, but certainly in Britain, and judging by what you're saying, housing is seen as being part of the remit of the state, and therefore constitutes a service. And the active participation of the citizenry in the production, maintenance, the conception, design, production, realization, implementation, and maintenance of these things is critical to their success. But she also talked about this issue around barriers and regulation being a critical problem, in that the citizenry can't actually engage at any point with regulation, with the policy that constructs this service, this particular service. Ostrom is talking more generally about other types of service, so things like policing and healthcare and education. But I think it's equally relevant to housing. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you see this specific barrier. Why you? I'm just pulling up my email here. Why you see the idea of regulation as a specific barrier?
Well, in this country, and I never learned enough about this in Great Britain to understand it fully. But in this country, zoning ordinances are sort of holy texts for local communities. Every city and town has their own zoning ordinance. So in Massachusetts, we have 351 cities and towns. It's a tiny little state, but we've divided it up mercilessly into all these tiny little places. But every city and town has their own zoning ordinance, and it can be very different. You cross that little silly line that we drew 300 years ago, and now you're in Somerville, or you're in Watertown, or you're in Belmont, and you've got a different zoning requirement than you do in Cambridge. My business partner, Bob Engler, asserts that there is no buildable land in Massachusetts zoned as of right for multifamily housing. Now, you can make in our economy, you make a general statement that if you can't build multifamily housing, you can't build affordable housing. That is, you need to spread the cost of land over a number of homes in the building in order to make the numbers work. So to not have land zoned for multifamily means you have to go and ask for permission for a variance from the zoning ordinance. And most towns just simply won't give you that if you want to build affordable housing, because they're not very enthusiastic about adding that to their stock in their community.
By this definition of multifamily housing, is that because that looks like Pruitt-Igoe, tower blocks? Is that the expectation?
Yeah, it is that is what drives this kind of way of laying out a zoning ordinance that we will say. Now, mind you, if you go into town and you want to build a luxury apartment building and you ask for his variance from the zoning, they might give you that because they see that as a big tax revenue for the city and town. Our cities and towns thrive on that. Most of their income is property tax, real estate property tax. And so they don't mind a luxury apartment building that is in town but they're not anxious to have an affordable housing development. And I would tell you part of that is the shape of the building. You're exactly right. But a part of it is the standard bias against poor people. Even though those poor people probably, or at least in eligible terms, could include the person who's teaching their kid in school, the person who's going to protect them from a fire in their home, the person who's going to clean their streets and take their trash away. Those people are all probably eligible for that housing. So this image that it's terrible people, those stupid poor people that don't work hard and all of that political stuff is just wrong. And finally, in our country, I would tell you that some piece of that is race. That is, people assume that people who have low incomes are Black or brown, and therefore they don't want Black or brown people in that town because they will reduce the property values. So, and every city and town is some combination of those factors, right? Somewhere between racial bias and dislike of high-rise buildings and suspicion of people without very much money and so on and so forth. And it's true for each individual. There are individuals who are not prepared to act in a racist way, but are worried about their property values. And so they think this will reduce their property value. So in our state, and our state on this score is the most progressive in the nation. We have a law that allows the state to override local zoning. You go to the rest of the country and they're just as likely to shoot you as not if you express that point of view. But in our state, we say every city and town is responsible to make sure that 10% of their housing stock is affordable. If you haven't met that standard and somebody comes to town and proposes a development, which would require variance or something like that, then if the town turns them down, they can come to the state and the state can say, sorry, town, you got to allow this. We built about 50,000 affordable homes over the 60 years of that statute in the state. No other state has anything like it. So it varies in various states. But I just would tell you that that element, and there's some ways it's less common now, but in some ways in which building codes can mitigate against affordable housing, and there's some ways in which processes. If you want to build some housing in our town, you got to go to this board, then you got to go to that board, then you got to go to this board, then you got to go to this board over here, and so any affordable housing developer faces a 2-year delay to get their project built, which can kill a deal in terms of the costs of holding onto the land and hiring advocates to go present your case and so on and so forth. So there's some other more arcane things like the number of votes you have to have to changing your zoning ordinance and sort of minor stuff. But yes, I think regulatory regimens are part of the problem for affordable housing. Yeah.
I think that segues beautifully with this. The thing that I wanted, as I said before we started recording, this issue around co-housing, which which kind of squares the circle a little bit, doesn't it?
Yes.
Co-housing. It's a model of housing which provides citizenship, and you've talked about that a little bit, I think. Citizen responsibility and citizen engagement. And it provides community, yeah, and it's more affordable, and it's denser. So you live in a co-housing.
I live in a co-op.
Oh, you live in a co-op, not a co-housing.
Which is just a little different from co-housing per se. Co-housing properties, which is an idea that swept across this country 15, 20 years ago from Denmark and has been adopted in many parts. Co-housing developments can be either cooperatives or condominiums in terms of their legal status. We organized ourselves as a cooperative, and we organized ourselves as a cooperative before the co-housing movement got here. If we'd been 20 years later, we probably would have said, "Oh, we should be co-housing." But then you still have to figure out: do we own our apartment, or do we own shares in the corporation, and the corporation owns our apartment, which is the way a co-op works. So yes, we bought this.
So in your particular case, you're a co-op, so you own shares in the co-op.
Right. And the shares entitle us to two things: to live in one of the apartments that the co-op owns, and secondly, to vote in the affairs of the co-op. So you can't have shares if you don't live here. And if you live here, you got to have shares, and you get to vote in the way the thing works. But you can't. We have no renters here, for example.
Okay, but you can't sell the apartment and profit off the back of it.
That's correct. What I have is shares, and we have an elaborate set of bylaws that explain what Sue and I can do if we want to leave. And it involves, in our particular case, and everybody can write this case the way they want to, but in our particular case, in this co-op, we will advertise the availability of shares. There'll be some people who can come and say they'd like to live here and buy those shares. We'll try to meet them and get other people who live here to meet them, and we'll talk a little bit about what it means to be in this co-op. We don't particularly interested in people who will sit in their apartment all day long and not talk to anybody and not go up to a work day and help us make some repairs around the building and so on and so forth. So there's a little bit of sort of it's a little tricky, but there's a little bit of a selection process involved in selling the shares. But it does mean that we've agreed that we can't just walk down a street corner and find a realtor and sell the shares and we're done with it. There's a process that involves everybody in the co-op. It's a small co-op. There are just 8 families here.
Mm-hmm. And as I was saying to you, it's like a shared job, isn't it? It's like a piece of work, this housing model, where you kind of, you collaborate. The building is a framework around which a form of socialization and citizenship. I mean, can occur. It's the house is a tool to obviously shelter and home and things like that, but it does something more significant.
I think that's exactly right, Ambrose. We bought this building in 1973. Of the 12 people who live here now, 8 of us have lived here all 50 years. And so it's quite a community. We've raised a spectacular set of children here. They come back and bring their children here. We have been politically engaged in our community. We have modeled, sort of political responsibility and professional responsibility. The kids have some sense of engagement in the communities that they've gotten from the way their parents are involved.
And you think that directly relates to the housing itself? This is the housing is an active agent in this process of socialization.
Absolutely. I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
For the first 15 years here, our family and another family that live in the building, the 2 women were college roommates, so we've been close friends for a very, very long time. But in order to make the building work, our 2 families actually shared an apartment. There was bedrooms and bathroom at one end of the house for us and bedrooms and bathrooms at the other end of the house for them. And then we had a dining room, living room, kitchen, and playroom that were common to both families. So the 8 of us, they have 2 kids, we have 2 kids, the 8 of us ate dinner together every night for 15 years. Our kids and their kids kind of grew up basically as brothers and sisters. And as they were getting toward the end of high school, it was getting a little tight in here. We had 5 teenagers in the house. Their 2 kids, our 2 kids, and a 5th kid whose parents had sort of abandoned him. There's a friend of our kids, so she lived with us for a year. 5 teenagers in the house, 1 telephone. It began to get a little tight, and one of the people upstairs moved out of her apartment, and we realized that we could. One of us families, the Stockards, were going to move upstairs to this apartment upstairs and expand it a little bit and work things out, and the Thompsons would stay downstairs. So one night at dinner, we said to her, anyway, just let you know, Janet's leaving, and so we're gonna open up her apartment a little bit, and the Stockards are gonna move up there, and the Thompson was, and the kids were outraged. You what? You can't, you never talk to us. You can't do this. You talk about citizen participation, and then you do something like this without consulting us. This is like a divorce. You can't do this. And of course, they were exactly right.
What did you do?
I mean, literally, Ambrose, this is up one flight of stairs. And we had even back stairs that connect the 2 apartments directly. But our kids had taken in so much from us about how one engages and how one includes everybody in the conversation. We make all decisions here by consensus. Yeah. The kids had seen this at work, and they were furious that we had forgotten about this when we made such a critical decision. So do I think the building in the context here has shaped the citizenship of the people in this building? Yes, I do.
Do you think it's more widely applicable, that this housing typology, the co-op or the co-housing? Do you think it actually, I know you say it swept the nation. We have these little pop-up, occasionally we come across these co-housing communities, and they are amazing. Funnily enough, weirdly enough, when I was doing that thing I was telling you about with the BBC, I looked around because the weekend before, I thought I'm going to go and see some co-housing. I'm going to go and see a intentional community,
right,
which is a lovely phrase. It's a lovely name for it.
Yeah,
and
I agree.
And so I typed it into Google, and I found one 15 miles away, and it was a strange but rather wonderful group called the Bruderhof. Now, so I got in my car with my children, and I went down to see the Bruderhof, and there they were making their German toys, and I had a wonderful day.
Yeah,
I had a wonderful day, and it was in an old. It was in an old school. It might well have been an old borstal. I'm not sure. An old sort of boys secure school. Anyway, whatever. And I was wondering, it got us thinking about, my wife and I thinking about how we would like to do this. But it's difficult. You've got to have a lot of capital up front.
Well,
it's not that applicable to average Joe and average Jane, is it?
Well, we were we were pretty average Joe and pretty Jane. That's probably unfair. The tricky part about our community is on a demographic scale, it's a tiny dot, right? We're all white, when we began, at least, heterosexual couples, father, mother, 2 kids, 1 boy, 1 girl. We just there's no diversity in this building at all. It's opened up a little bit since then, but there was that about us. And what I would say is, and we all, the men all had 2nd degrees by then. The women were on their way to a 2nd degree, but we weren't making big money. No lawyers, no doctors, city planners, and so on. And so, interestingly enough, we couldn't get a bank to finance us. And I won't bore you with all the details, but we ended up getting financing from a very unusual source. And
what, in Boston, Massachusetts? I don't. The mind boggles. Your reputation precedes you. And as a Red Sox fan, I am highly suspicious, by the way.
We were able to pull it off with the combination of some resources that we pulled together. We had at least one outside person who believed in what we were doing and gave us a little capital, and she said, really, I'd like to give you some money, and I can't live there because I live up in Maine, but I could come down to Boston. I'd like a place to stay when I come down to Boston. I think she only ever stayed in that room one time. She was really giving us some money to help us get this done. Another person bought some shares and never moved in, but he let us keep the capital. So we had a little bit of help from other folks. But it was, when we bought it, it was a 12 apartment building. We've since mucked it around until it's only 8 apartments now. Our rents now are, I remember I told you that $3,500 number. Our rents are about $1,500 a month. So it's a huge difference because we do a lot of the management ourselves, although we now have a management company that helps us out. But the biggest difference is $1,500 is about what it costs to run an apartment building like this. And the $3,500 means those private for-profit folks are taking $2,000 a month and putting it in their back pocket every month. My most radical idea is that I want the private for-profit organizations out of the rental housing business, because as long as they're running your home, as long as they own your home, they're not going to leave any money on the table. And in a sort of a naive philosophical way, you would say, they're not being evil, they're just doing exactly what capitalism says you should do. You should maximize the value of your asset, take home profits, use those profits to build more assets, provide more jobs, et cetera. That's what a good capitalist does. So they're just behaving the way they're supposed to behave. But it doesn't help people with housing needs that don't have enough money to pay for that cost, even though they ought to and would like to live in Cambridge.
Well, it's a really wonderful. I think it's a really wonderful example to finish on of your own, which is very personal, and I'm very grateful that you would be willing to share it. But I've really enjoyed hearing some of your thoughts. Well, a tiny fraction of your thoughts on some of these issues. And perhaps perhaps I haven't done you justice and given you time enough to kind of unpack things.
And let me say one more thing. Let me say one more thing about the co-op. The group of people who've gathered here in Commonplace, which is the name of our co-op, are somewhat unusual for our generation, right? There are not a lot of people in our generation who would have wanted to be in a housing setting where you had a meeting every month about the building and about the other things going on in town. It would not have wanted to live in a building that was sort of this sharing this much of your life with other families this close together. Right? But I do believe that your students are a part of a different generation, and maybe you are as well. That is, where sharing is a much bigger piece of how you understand the world to work. These younger generations share bikes, they share cars, they share laundromats, all kinds of things. And so I'm hopeful that as we go forward, more and more people will feel like some kind of shared housing, because I do believe that a ton of people want more connections. They feel more isolated. They feel as though they don't have a friendship circle that's you. They have business friends, but they don't have people just to hang around with and people to talk to when things are hard. We've been through divorces here. A couple of people have died here, and we can talk to each other about those things in important ways. And it's been it couldn't have been a better way to survive COVID than to be in this building with other people that we've known and loved for 50 years. So I do believe that there's hope that this form of housing will expand. And what that means is the average starter home for a family in this country is now 2,600 square feet. Each of us in this building at exactly the stage in our lives when we would have gone out and bought a single family home in the suburbs of 2,600 square feet, in fact, have raised our kids here in about 1,000 square feet. So we've had a lighter footprint on the planet. And that's something else that will be attractive to the younger generations. Sorry to get a little preachy at the end there, Ambrose, but I thought I want to say to the students that you're speaking to that I'm very hopeful about their generation and the kinds of things they will do with housing going forward.
Yes. Well, I think that's very beautiful. And I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful for that, because I think it is, as you say, it's a wonderful model and it's a wonderful opportunity and inspiring change as well. So thank you very much, Jim. I really appreciate it.
I'm so glad you asked me to do this, Ambrose. It was great to see you again. Thank you very much. This was great fun for me and I really enjoyed doing it.
Well, thank you too. Really, really do appreciate it. Well, ain't that sweet? Thank you to Jim for his passion and willingness to share so much. Please see the podcast description for links to the video and article mentioned, and for Jim's professional and academic profile. And of course, do please like, subscribe, follow and share A is for Architecture everywhere. Cheers.